1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the Week 7 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host. I am your guest. I am JMToWin. Throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed, and let's get started with a slate that I am very much falling in love with. Real quickly before we get started, in case you missed it last week, we are now also doing the Angles podcast in video version. So if you prefer to watch my face in a box on your phone or your computer, you can catch this on the 1 week season YouTube channel in addition to catching it on the 1 week season podcast feed. Lots to get to today, and I like to try to keep this to about an hour. So we are going to dive right in, and I'm going to start out by talking about a conversation that Aaron and I had a couple weeks ago. Aaron is our what is Aaron? Our not our CTO, he's our something on the site. Anyhow, he's one of the guys who helps me run everything. He is the guy who helps me run everything. But anyhow, Aaron and I were talking a couple weeks ago about this super hot start to the season that the OWS fam as a whole have had. That was after, I think it was after week 4. And Aaron was saying it's been really great in terms of like all the traffic that we get to the site from the shows and whatever else we do. And it's been great that we've had such a hot start to the season because so many more people are really paying attention and wanting to join up with the OWS community, with the OWS fam, and be part of what we're building here. And I said to him that week, I said, the crazy thing is, this isn't just we started the season hot. I said, this is totally sustainable that we're going to keep this going. I started doing MME play in week 9 of last year, and I've played now 14 weeks since then, and had 10 out of 14 profitable weeks since then, and 8 out of 14 profitable weeks in single entry, 3 max play. And then on top of that, we've had Inner Circle going for, this is our 3rd year with Inner Circle now. And every people who've been in Inner Circle every week in and week out, they're getting all of this training about what DFS is really about and how to build for first place and what that looks like and what that looks like for that season and through a particular slate, and put all of that together. And it's not just like, oh, wow, OWS had a hot start to the season. But instead, in my mind, I was looking at it like, this is going to keep happening. Like I have a process and approach, a system right now that's working really well for me. We have all of these users who have become really sharp DFS players. And I said, this isn't something like, hey, it's cool that we had this hot start and we're able to kind of capture this with getting some extra people into the community. It's more a situation of this is going to keep happening throughout this season and it's going to roll into next season. So I said that to him heading into week 5. Week 5, we had kind of our first down week of the season, but then we bounced right back in week 6 and had one of our biggest weekends that we've had in a while. Actually, probably not one of our biggest weekends we've had in a while. The Millie Maker winner uses OWS as part of his research and roster building process. But if you take out that $1 million win, it wasn't even our biggest weekend of the year. We had a lot of first place finishes, a lot of second place finishes, a lot of top 3, top 5, top 10 finishes from the community. But we had other weekends where we had, a week where we had like 5 or 6 six-figure cashes in one weekend from the community. And we're going to keep this going. So as I've been saying, if you haven't hit yet, and you're putting in the time, you're paying attention to all the things we talk about, you are building sharp rosters, don't worry that you haven't hit yet. Look around you. It keeps happening for everybody else in the community. Your time is coming. Mike Johnson had been on a little bit of a cold streak, and then he hit for second place in 2 different major tournaments this last week, and I think picked up like 30 or 40K at once in those 2, right? Like you kind of keep putting in the time, and those things hit and kind of makes up for, multiple years worth of cold streaks. None of you are going to have those multiple years worth of cold streaks either. So really cool. I wanted to mention that off the top, but I also wanted to say that to tie it into how do we ensure that we can keep doing this? I look at it like Clay Buchholz. Let's go back to baseball. Okay. Clay Buchholz threw a no-hitter his rookie year. I think it was like his 4th career start. Clay Buchholz was never a consistent all-star pitcher. He was really kind of like a solid number 3 pitcher in a rotation. And yet he had stuff that was good enough to throw a no-hitter. What tends to separate good athletes from great athletes, and baseball is a really great example of it, where you got kind of have like the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pitchers, is consistency. A number 1 pitcher is typically going to have 1 or 2 or 3 bad games in 30 plus starts in a season. Whereas that number 3 pitcher, that number 4 pitcher, they might have just as much talent as that number 1 guy. They might be able to have a really nice game with a bunch of strikeouts, or where they really suppress runs or whatever it might be. And yet they're not able to do that consistently. They're not able to do that start in and start out. When you look at quarterbacks, when teams are evaluating quarterbacks, a lot of times it's, do they have a repeatable motion? Do they have a repeatable delivery? Same thing with basketball players. Do they have a repeatable delivery? Same thing with hitters. And so the difference between somebody who can do well and somebody who is great, somebody who consistently does well, is that repeatable motion, that repeatable delivery, that consistency that they're able to achieve. So similarly in DFS, most of us at OWS, most of you who have been on the site for more than a few months, and even those of you who just joined this year, you probably know the ins and outs of DFS strategy and theory by this point well enough that you can put together a winning roster. The question is, are you able to do it week in and week out? Are you able to have that repeatable delivery, so to speak, to where you know with a high level of confidence that you are going to have profit over time because you're putting positive samples into the bucket every single week? I could have gone 0-6 this year to start the year in terms of profitable weeks, and I would be just as confident as, well, maybe not just as confident, because there is like the human side of things where you'd be like, man, this really sucks. But generally speaking, I'd be almost as confident in my process, my approach, my play, as I am having had 4 of 6 profitable weeks. And, I said earlier this year that kind of the way things break down, the way I look at it is, I basically needed to have, X number of weeks where I could sustain X number of weeks where I lost money, X number of weeks where I broke even, and then 3 weeks where I had kind of like bigger weeks. Well, I've already had my 3 bigger weeks for this year, as in like that's what I needed to do throughout an entire season to be at profit on the year. Well, I've already had my 3 bigger weeks, and we're only through week 6, right? And that's happened, and that like backs up, okay, my process is really good, but also I'm 6-0 on the season in terms of 6 Sundays that right before kickoff, I've assessed everything and been like, did I put in a really good week? Did I overlook anything? If I could play out the slate 100 times, would it be profitable? All 6 weeks, I felt very confident, very consistent in my delivery, in my approach. And the same would be the case even if I'd had, one of the weeks where I didn't hit, one of my down weeks, I also bubbled in my main single entry 3 max build. So I was that close to that being a profitable week. Well, flip that around, and I could have had a stretch of 4 or 5 weeks where I bubbled in contest and finished outside the money, and yet my process would have been the same, and I would be able to look at these weeks and say, okay, if I played out this slate 100 times exactly the way that I approached it, I would have been profitable over that 100 stretch sample size. And so if you're able to do that, you're going to make money over time. At the same time, the edges in DFS are small. The edges are very much there. I actually think that they're growing. It's something I've talked about recently based on a variety of factors of how people are playing DFS right now. So the edges are growing, but the edges are still small. And a lot of DFS is about, okay, I'll use another example from sports. The Patriots, all those years where they had the bend but don't break defense. And, Tom Brady was a superstar quarterback, but really that started in the 2007 season. And even beyond that 2007 season, he wasn't typically a statistically superstar quarterback. And a lot of what those Patriots teams did was their goal was, we are going to not make mistakes. And most opponents are going to make enough mistakes throughout a game that they're going to beat themselves. And so the Patriots could end up getting 8, 9, 10 of their regular season wins throughout the season just from teams beating themselves against the Patriots. Kind of funny because that's the crazy thing about this year's Patriots team is that they are just completely beating themselves. A team that, with similar or lesser talent made the playoffs 2 years ago, now is a team at the bottom of the NFL. More on the Patriots later in this show. But DFS is the same way. If we are making the little mistakes, then we are constantly giving back our edge. If instead we just say, hey, we're going to be very consistent week in and week out. Sure, there was the games that the Patriots had to go out and win where they had less talent on their team because they collected a roster full of sort of versatile guys who knew football well and didn't make mistakes. And it's like they go play the Ravens or they go play the Peyton Manning Colts, and it's like, oh, they don't have as good of a team as this opponent, and they're kind of an underdog to win this game. They have to do more than just not make mistakes, but they could get to that playoff threshold of wins just from waiting for their opponents to make mistakes and not making mistakes themselves. And that should be our starting point as DFS players, is saying, how do we position ourselves to be consistent week in and week out? And then above and beyond that, we can start adding in the extra things that really give us that additional edge. But if you're giving back the little things with mistakes, then you're going to be the person who's giving the money to the people who are making money in DFS over time. So one of the best ways to ensure that you have a repeatable delivery, ensure that week in and week out, you are putting yourself in position for plus EV play, plus expected value play, which means that, again, say if you played out the slate 100 times, would you make money on that slate or not? Not did you make money on that particular weekend, but if you could play out the slate 100 times, would you have made money? That's what plus EV means. So are you positioning yourself for plus EV play week in and week out? Well, one of the easiest ways to do that is to have a weekly process that builds toward your rosters. So everybody's process is going to look different because everybody sees things differently. Everybody's lifestyle is different. Everybody's level of commitment to DFS is a little bit different. But I'm going to quickly, so if you're an Inner Circle member, you've heard me talk about my process more deeply than I'm going to right now. If you've been on OWS for a long time, you've probably heard me talk about my process. But I want to touch on it right now because I think it's important at this point in the season where even if you've been profitable, but especially if you have not been profitable to start the season, then you want to examine things and say, okay, is there anything I'm doing wrong? Is there anything I can be doing better? It's probably less about what you're doing when you build your rosters on Saturday and Sunday. And it's probably more about the steps that are leading into when you're building your rosters on Saturday and Sunday. In fact, if you're not able to assess your rosters before kickoff on Sunday morning, if you're not able to assess your play before kickoff on Sunday morning and confidently say whether or not it was a plus EV sample size that you're putting into the bucket right there, then there's probably more that you need to be doing during the week leading up to the start of your play. There's probably more that you need to be doing in order to be in position to confidently assess your play. So I'm going to walk through my process. This isn't a prescription for you. It just gives you an idea of what a solid process can look like. So for me, everything is about starting from a broad funnel down. So if you picture a funnel, the bottom of the funnel has the part that the water or whatever you're pouring in gets concentrated through. Well, that bringing it down to this narrowest possible point of like, okay, here's where we want everything to flow. But you want to start out with this broad funnel to make sure that you're really not missing anything on the week. So again, there's 5 steps to my process. And this is kind of my process with anything I do, whether it's business stuff, creative stuff, DFS stuff. But my 5 steps are always collect, sketch, blueprint, build, and carve. And so the collect phase for me is Tuesdays. And collect is where I am gathering as much information as I can. So I'm not trying to make decisions on that day. Oftentimes Monday's my day off, but oftentimes I kind of open up the slate on Monday and start getting a feel for it. Every once in a while I need just like a total break and wait till Tuesday, but usually I get an early start in collecting on Monday and I'm looking through the games. I'm just kind of seeing, okay, who's on this slate? I'm not making decisions yet. I'm not saying, oh man, I'm definitely going to play this guy this week, or this guy really stands out, or this guy's not a good play. I'm just gathering information at that point. On Tuesday, obviously I'm listening to press conferences all day. I'm watching as many of the games from the previous week as I can. I do some of that on Monday as well. In places where I can't watch full games because time doesn't allow for that, along with everything else, I'm watching some highlights from games and making sure that I have a sense of what's going on with all of these teams. And again, what's going on with the coaches? What are the coaches saying? What are the players saying? Are there any little nuggets that I can pick up listening to these press conferences throughout the day on Tuesday? So that is the collect phase, is I'm getting as much information as I can, making sure I continue to know these teams well. If you don't have time for that, most of you don't, right? But how do you continue to get to know the teams well? Well, listen to the NFL Edge every week. It comes out on Friday mornings. Every single game broken down from top to bottom. You can throw it on 2x speed on the 1 week season podcast speed. Throw it on 2x speed. You'll catch all the games in 40 or 50 minutes of your time. What's your commute, or that's while you're making breakfast and getting the kids ready for school or whatever it is, right? Listen to the NFL Edge or read the NFL Edge every single week. Get to know these teams and players and coaches better. Pay attention to all the content that we're putting out that allows you to get to know these teams and players and coaches better. Your collect process might be as simple as spending 30 minutes looking at the slate, but it's not 30 minutes in passing. It's not 30 passive minutes. It's, okay, I'm going to block out distractions and for 30 minutes, kind of go game by game. And what I'll do typically is I go in the app, go to the quarterback position, and I click on the first game so that all I'm seeing is the quarterbacks from that first game. Then I go to the second and I kind of think through, okay, like how does this game set up? How do these two teams interact? If you don't know the answers to those, then keep learning more about these teams, about these players, about these coaches. Pay attention to what we say in these podcasts. Listen to the NFL Edge, read the NFL Edge, read Roto World blurbs every day, but get to know these teams and coaches and players. But you can look and say, okay, these two teams are the first game of the week. In fact, if I look at the app this week, first game, Detroit and Baltimore. So what I know is, okay, that's two really good defenses, two teams that are capable of putting up big plays, but they're probably going to have to march the field because Detroit's going to try to force Baltimore to take the underneath throws. Baltimore's going to try to do the same thing to Detroit. Both teams are going to try to tighten up in the red zone. So it's going to be like, you got to march the field and then you got to score in the red zone, right? You're probably not scoring from 30 yards, 40 yards out. And then it's harder to score in the red zone. So defense tightens up, potentially opportunities for this to turn into more of a field goal type game. But if the touchdowns do start scoring, well, both teams have explosive weapons, there's a chance that this game could open up a little bit more, even with how good the defenses are, and kind of think through each game in that way. Las Vegas and Chicago. Okay, you got backup quarterbacks. We don't really know who's going to be the quarterback for the Raiders yet. Bears are decent against the run, bad against the pass. Raiders are bad against the run and the pass. That opens opportunities for either offense to have a good game as long as they don't shoot themselves in the foot. Make some offensive players a little bit interesting in this spot. Are there any offensive players who might go overlooked, right? And so we kind of keep going through the process in that way. Actually, the Raiders are decent against the pass and bad against the run. So kind of flip those two defenses where the Bears are decent against the run, bad against the pass. Raiders are decent against the pass, bad against the run. Neither team is scary in any component, but how you best attack them is different on both sides of the ball. So I go game by game and just kind of, you can do that, right? Take 15, 20 minutes. And all of a sudden now you've opened up your thoughts and you're not making any decisions. You're just getting a sense of you're just collecting information, getting a sense of what the slate provides. Sketch would be for me Wednesday. And sketch is where I'm going to start really trying to, for me, it's going to be writing my DFS interpretations, but it's like, I'm really trying to get a deeper sense of, okay, what's likeliest to happen in each of these games? Same thing. You might not have a ton of time for this, or maybe you don't have the full week for this. I do like spreading this out throughout the whole week because if you open your thoughts on Tuesday, Monday or Tuesday, your subconscious is going to be working on that problem the rest of the time. It's similar to if any of you have played video games, which is most of you, and you play a video game and you get stuck on a part and you can sit there for an hour and remain stuck on that part. I'm not actually a gamer myself, but I've had this experience before and I've kind of read about how the mind works and this sort of thing, to where I've had this in sports as well, where you're like, I cannot get this. And then you leave the problem, come back the next day and you're able to beat it immediately. And gamers see that all the time where you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. You leave, you come back the next day, you can do it right away. Well, that's because when you're working on a problem, you store that problem in your subconscious and continue to work on it in the background of your mind while you're away from that problem. So when you come back to it, you've gained more ground on that problem than if you wait until Saturday to open up the slate and start thinking about it at that point. At the same time, you don't want to get into that trap of making decisions on Tuesday and Wednesday. And, okay, I'm definitely playing this guy, or I'm definitely not playing this guy. Instead, put yourself in a position where you are just trying to gain additional information on the slate. You're trying to gain a deeper feel for the slate. So that sketch portion for you could be, again, for me, it's writing up my DFS interpretations. For you, it could be really sort of maybe jotting down your thoughts, pinning down your thoughts on how these games are likeliest to play out, what some of the players are that you might like to use from these games. If I had more time for practice builds, that would be every single day of the week. I would be doing that. In my schedule, it's primarily, I do a little bit on Monday night if I open the slate early. I dedicate a couple hours on Tuesday nights to practice builds. And some of these practice builds take 45 minutes for me to complete one build, especially early in the week, because what happens is I'm going game by game and then it's like, oh, you know what? Let me go ahead and build a practice build around Lamar Jackson, or let me go ahead and build a practice build around Josh Allen. Let me go ahead and build a practice build around Sam Howell. So as I'm then thinking through that game, that gets me into that groove of blocking out distractions, getting in the flow of thoughts about the game. And then I start thinking about, okay, and what would I piece with this, right? What I actually like to do is when I'm building my practice builds, I'll go click on the first game in the app, Detroit, Baltimore, click on the second game in the app, Las Vegas, Chicago, click on the third game, Cleveland, Indianapolis, click on the fourth game, Buffalo, New England. Once I pick a spot that I'm like, okay, I'm going to build around this quarterback. Then when I go to the running back position, I don't start back at the beginning, but I go to the next game, Washington and the Giants. Go to the next game, Atlanta and Tampa Bay. So I continue to progress through, in the case of this week's slate, through the 10 games on the slate as I go position by position. So I'm not trying to break down the whole slate at this point when I'm doing my practice builds. I'm just saying, let me take it in smaller pieces. I've gone through 4 quarterbacks and 4 games at quarterback, and maybe I stop on Buffalo, New England, and I decide to build a Josh Allen, Dalton Kincaid stack, okay? Just as an example. So then I go to running back. The next game in the DraftKings app this week is Washington at New York. So maybe, I open that, I'm like, oh, you know what? I'll put Brian Robinson on this roster. And that forces me to then think through, okay, what is Brian Robinson's range of outcomes? And as you guys know, I like to demystify everything by turning it into raw numbers. It was really interesting. Pete Overzet did a show a week or two ago with Utica, one of the DFS legends. And he was the first person I'd actually heard talk about the same thing, which was, he essentially said that like his simulator, his optimizer, his projections are knowing the game well. And he has projections, but they're all just in his mind. And that's very much how I like to do things is I'm going to just work through, okay, Brian Robinson, well, what's his best case scenario against the Giants? Does he go for 100 rushing yards? That's pretty low likelihood. So in order for him to be a tournament winner, he probably needs to score 2 touchdowns. And so then I sort of work through, what does it take for him to score 2 touchdowns? How likely is that? What are the chances of that happening? Is there anybody else from his offense that would need to also be hitting in order for him to be able to score 2 touchdowns? Is there anything that would have to happen in this game environment in order for him to have to score 2 touchdowns? And so you kind of see how, as you break things down, position by position and game by game, it gives you a chance to really ask these questions organically. Where if you look at the whole slate, you're taking this giant puzzle and trying to solve it all at once, as opposed to just continuing to get more information on each of these spots. And this is why my practice builds don't go into play. This is just opportunities to collect information. So again, I've moved to in this example, I've gone through the first 4 games at quarterback, finally decided, hey, this 4th game is where I'm building this practice build. So then I go to the 5th game at running back, and now I've decided, okay, I'm going to play Brian Robinson. I go to the 6th game, which is Atlanta, Tampa, think through those running backs and decide, okay, I'm not going to pull the trigger on one of these in this roster. Go to the 7th game, Pittsburgh and the Rams. It forces me to start thinking through the Zach Evans situation. Then maybe I say, okay, I'm going to pull the trigger on Zach Evans on this particular roster. And then I move to the wide receiver position. So now I've got the 8th, 9th, and 10th games in the DraftKings app left. I go to that 8th game, which is Arizona, Seattle, think through those wide receivers. Forces me to ask questions about, okay, Seattle gives up big production, but not typically on the perimeter. So who on the Cardinals runs their routes over the middle of the field? Surprisingly, it's actually Rondell Moore who gets a lot of those routes out of the slot over the middle of the field. Maybe he's more interesting than people typically give him credit for. Maybe I throw him on this practice build. I'm not making decisions. I don't have to play Rondell Moore on any of my rosters on Sunday. It's just working through the slate, sort of game by game, position by position. Go to this Green Bay Denver game, which is the 9th game. And maybe I'm going to put Christian Watson on this roster. Go to the Chargers and Chiefs. Maybe I put nobody from that roster. So then I go back to the beginning of all the games, right? And I click on that Detroit Baltimore game again, and I start from there for my last 2 wide receiver spots, and then kind of do the same thing at defense. So what you're essentially doing is you continue to work through all the spots. You continue to work through all the options, but in this very organic way where you're not trying to make decisions. You're not trying to put everything together. I think that's probably talked about the practice builds for years. That might be the deepest outside of Winner Circle podcasts for Inner Circle members. That might be the deepest I've gotten into, like exactly what my process looks like for those practice builds and why I feel it's so valuable. But again, sketch would be the Wednesday step for me. And I would recommend turning that into your Wednesday step, where you're basically just saying, okay, I'm going to carve out some time where I'm going to sort of pin down broader thoughts on each of these games. Blueprint for me that's where I kind of build out my player pool. So that's Thursdays. You could read the NFL Edge on Thursdays. You could leave your blueprint for Fridays, where you maybe the NFL Edge and DFS interpretations are up, or you could listen to the NFL Edge, but kind of pin down like, okay, this isn't necessarily exactly what I'm going to do on Saturday night when I'm building rosters, but here's a sense of what my player pool probably looks like. As you guys see on my Sunday morning updates in the player grid, my Friday player pool in the player grid is usually very, very close to my final player pool. So you've gathered research, you've gathered information, gathered your thoughts. You're not making decisions yet on like, hey, this guy's going on my main build, this guy's going on my main build, this guy's going on my single entry play, but it's more like, here's a pool of players that I'll be choosing from. These are all sharp plays. I don't have to make these decisions yet on like, do I really want to play this guy, or how much of this guy do I want to play? It's not the time of the week for that yet. Don't waste brain power on that yet. Just keep moving down the funnel. Now you're getting from what's the whole slate down to, okay, who's in my player pool? Who even if you're playing just single entry with one roster, like who's in my player pool? Who am I shopping among? Don't make any decisions yet. And then Friday and Saturday for me are the build and carve phases. So building would be really building out what my player pool looks like. And then carving would be making those final changes and whatnot. So as I've talked about, I won't get too deep into this, but as I've talked about, I do building on Friday night. That's my final night for practice rosters, practice builds. And some of those start to my Thursday night practice builds, my Friday night practice build. Some of those start to actually go into contests where I'll build one and say, oh, I really like this. I'll throw it into the slant and the play action. And then it's set aside as one that I might actually use on single entry 3 max when I start shopping through those later in the week. And then Saturday is when I really start from scratch again, but I kind of am able to move from the top of the funnel down quickly. So Saturday night, you don't have to do this because it is time intensive, but Saturday night, I still go game by game and I build out my allocation of my percentages, and it's still built off of everything I've picked up throughout the week. But I am, and typically, it comes 80% close to what I would have expected on Friday, but I find those little pieces of like, hey, I wasn't thinking about this guy, or maybe I want a little bit more of this guy than I thought, or, let me research a little bit more on this guy and find out a couple more things. And then Saturday night, it's like, okay, now here's my player pool, and then get it into the Bink machine and kind of start playing around with those final rules and piecing everything together, making any final changes that I want to make in that carve type setting. Also could be considered carve, the part where I shop through my 150 rosters and pick out my favorite ones for single entry 3 max play, which could be anywhere from 8 rosters to 13, 14, 15 rosters. Again, I've had discussions on what that process looks like for me. I know we've been getting a lot of questions about it. So just real quickly, like I go roster by roster through all 150. As I've said many times, what I try to do is I will look at a roster and I'll like take a breath, make sure that my mind isn't wandering, make sure that I'm actually focused on what I'm doing. Take a breath, look at that roster. If that roster doesn't stand out to me as a really sharp roster, then I close my eyes, take a breath, reset, look at the next roster. That way I'm not just like scrolling through and looking at them quickly, but each one is sort of its own entity. And a lot of them, I look at it for 3 seconds and it's like, all right, that one's not going into single entry 3 max play. It doesn't stand out to me. And it's not just an intellect thing. It's a feel thing too. It's like, what rosters are you looking at? And you're like, whoa, that roster is really good. Like you react to that roster in a way where you're like, that roster is really good. And then sometimes it's rosters that I look at it and I can't move on from it right away. And I kind of look at it like, what does this roster do? And as you kind of start looking at it, you're like, well, this is not really players that pop to me, but this is a really well-constructed roster. It's got a clear path to first place. So I'll set this roster aside. And I go through my 150 and usually end up setting anywhere from like 25 to 40 aside. And the way I set them aside is I enter them into the play action and I forget now what it's called, but there's a $4 20 max contest. The play action is a $3 20 max contest. But basically like that allows me to then see afterward which rosters went from having 1 entry, all 150 are in the slant, which rosters went from having 1 entry to now having 2 entries. And so then I can shop through those rosters and again, see, okay, which of these 15, 25, 30, 40 rosters are the ones that stand out to me the most for single entry max. So again, while I'm going through, you're going from a broad funnel down to a narrow. You're going, here's my 150 rosters. Let me go through and see which ones stand out to me with no pressure of like, okay, I'm putting this amount of money on them. okay, these 20 stand out to me, these 25 stand out to me. And then I shop through those and say, okay, which ones are going into my single entry 3 max play? Which ones are my best ones out of this group? And once you have that pile of like your 30 best rosters, it's easy to see which ones are the best among those. And then you have your pile for single entry 3 max play. So having that process where whatever it looks like for you, but where it goes from broad funnel down to narrow. Another thing I've talked about a lot on the site since the start of last year is how valuable, and I've mentioned it over the years, but I really focused on it one time early last year, and I've mentioned a few more times since then, but how valuable DFS is for us in terms of how we can translate this to other areas of our life. And what I've said is you could play DFS, play it seriously, and that doesn't mean lots of money, and that doesn't mean tons of time, but play it seriously, and I'll get back to what I mean by seriously, but play it seriously for 5 years. Be a losing player, which would be hard to do if you're kind of taking everything we talked about on OWS, but be a losing player year in and year out for 5 years. And it would still be worth the money that you lost in DFS because of how much you would learn that would help you increase your economic ceiling in other areas of life. And so many of the smartest, highest upside-minded people that I've met in my life, all of the smartest, highest upside-minded people that I've met in my life, I've met in the DFS space. And a lot of them, similar to me, came into this DFS space without being that super high upside-oriented type of person, or at least without having all the tools to put that into play. There's so many people who I've watched grow up in this DFS space and go from being good DFS players to being like really good at succeeding in life in general. And it's been through the lessons that they've learned in DFS. So what do I mean by taking it seriously? It doesn't have to be something where you're like, oh, I'm going to put in so much time, I'm going to outwork everybody else from a quantity standpoint, but it's a qualitative thing. It is, are you dedicating some attention to this? And are you giving yourself an opportunity each week to build a plus EV set of rosters? And really, ideally, you treat each NFL, most of us on here are NFL only DFS players, which, side note, if you missed this in the Angles email, we have added the Bink machine for NBA. So really excited about that. It's only $179. And if you use code TIPOFF, it takes $20 off. You can use that through the end of the next Tuesday. So if you play NBA DFS and don't feel like you need a content subscription where you're being told who the good plays are, you just need projections, ownership projections, a community to bounce ideas off of. The Bink machine's a really great way to, most NBA DFS subscriptions are like $350 without the optimizer, and then an extra couple $100 for an optimizer. So if you don't feel like you need the content side of things, and what you really just need is the projections, the ownership projections, and a sharp community to bounce thoughts off of, Bink machine's a really sharp way to go, especially if you've been using the Bink machine for NFL and you're really comfortable with it. You want to use that for NBA. So that is now, go to the tools on the site and you'll find Bink machine for NBA. But most of us on here are NFL only DFS players. So treat NFL season every year, A, with the expectation of making money, and then B, as a training ground. And so from both of those, you shift your mindset from like, here's something I do on the side, to here's something that's sort of integral to my weekly process during NFL season. And the more process oriented you can be, the more you're like, okay, I know that my Monday looks like this. So what's great about NFL DFS and why it's such a great training ground is every week we're working toward an end point. Every week we're working toward the rosters that we're going to have in play on Sunday. So it can train you in like, how do I build a structure so that my whole week from Monday to Sunday leads toward a sharp plus EV set of rosters. And what you'll find is then when you get into the off season, you kind of feel that emptiness of not having that process throughout the week and that end goal at the end of the week. Why my wife, who is all about optimizing relaxation, and she'll see, like people who make hundreds of millions of dollars in business, or they sell this startup for this huge amount, and then they start something new. And she's like, why would they do that? And she's like, how much money do they need? She'll sometimes say that. And I'll say, it's not about the money. It's you see the same thing with NFL players or NFL coaches, where it's like, it's not even about the money so much as it is like the joy of having this process every week that is toward like an end result at the end of the week. And so you find that you can start pulling this into other areas of your life during the rest of the year. The other, what is that, 32 weeks, the other 33 weeks of non-NFL regular season, 34 weeks, 18-week regular season. There you go. So 34 weeks of the season, like the other 34 weeks of the year, you find that you start kind of, okay, what do I want to work toward this week? And then life becomes less about just whatever nebulous things happen on a given week. And then you look back over a 2-month span and you're like, where did those 2 months go? And it becomes more about, okay, I have this bigger goal and every week is structured toward maximizing my paths toward that bigger goal. And what's cool about that is the more structured things are, the more freedom you actually have to sort of enjoy the day to day as well, because like, oh, well, it's important to step back. It's important to re-energize. It's important to refill with whatever it is for you, right? Your friends, your family. And so you have these times that are set aside in your process that's specifically for that. And that allows you to be really fully dedicated and focused to that in those times. So all of that to say, like, this will help you in NFL DFS, but also can help you in all areas of your life. But start out with this NFL DFS mindset and say, how can I build a process that takes me from the top of the funnel down to the bottom of the funnel every single week, and every week be willing to tweak your process. If you listen to me talk about my process 4 years ago versus now, there's probably a lot that has changed. The core is the same, but I'm always tweaking my process. And it's not even about finding a better process so much as things get stale after a while and you want to do something a little bit different with your Mondays. You want your Tuesdays to look a little bit different. And so those things develop over time, but give yourself the opportunity for that to start developing. And what you'll also find is, when I said to Aaron that, what's crazy is this is going to keep happening. And, fast forward 2 weeks from that. And once again, it was, when I said it was our biggest weekend of the year, week 6, it was, I think, our biggest volume weekend of the year in terms of binks flowing into the Bink Machine channel. Probably not our biggest, if you throw out the Millie Maker win, which, I don't even know if he's a subscriber to 1 week season. I know that he uses 1 week seasons research as part of his process, but throw out the Millie Maker win, and cumulatively money won by OWS might have been like our second biggest or third biggest weekend of the year. But in terms of quantity of people who had big weekends, it was our biggest weekend of the year. And that was a week and a half after I'd said that to Aaron and said, what's crazy is this is sustainable. Like, this is going to keep happening for the community because we've built the community to a point where we have such sharp DFS players. And then my process is to a point where I'm going to be sharp every week, which helps kind of from a standpoint of helping you guys get a feel for the slate. And so you can compound that even further by having that sharp process of your own. If you want to bounce thoughts on this off of people, go to the OWS Discord. I'm sure there's a lot of people in there who have built out really good weekly processes. And I'd love to see this kind of be a topic of discussion among you guys this weekend, because any of you who don't yet have that can kind of get some help in this area. Okay, so along those same lines, and let's kind of pull it over to this week. What this week provides, I talked in the Angles email about the parable of the Chinese farmer, in which, if you've never heard it, I almost posted a link to it, but all the sites that have it are just people's personal blogs and whatnot. First time I ever heard it was Tom Brady quoted the whole thing, but since then I've seen it in several other places. But it's basically the concept of the parable of the Chinese farmer is there's this Chinese farmer who something really bad, supposedly, quote, really bad happens to him, to his family. And all his neighbors are saying, oh, how awful. And his response is, maybe. And then something really good happens. And his response from his family, from his neighbors is how wonderful that was. And his response is maybe. And you keep seeing through this parable that, the bad thing actually led to this other thing that was everybody perceived as really good. And then that really good thing led to this other thing that everyone perceived as really bad. And if we can take those labels off and just say maybe to things, then we're better equipped to maneuver forward, because we don't attach emotional assessments beforehand, and instead we're able to kind of keep our eyes clear. And how that relates to this week is this is very much a week that most people are going to open it and say, man, this slate's ugly. This slate sucks. And if you're thinking that way, well, we always say chalk forms no matter what. And we say that specifically to gear us up for weeks like this, a week where, oh, the slate's kind of ugly, and yet there's chalk. And right now, based on like current ownership projections, really heavy chalk. And so we have a spot where, again, chalk is going to typically be sharp in that the plays that are going to be most popular are generally good plays and are probably a little bit better than the non-chalky plays. But I've described it this morning as, instead of a week where we have plays that are head and shoulders above other plays, we have a week where there's plays that are like forehead and hair above other plays. And yet, because there's less to like on this week, those plays are becoming even more popular than most of the good chalk that we tend to see. So if you enter this week saying, man, this week's ugly, what happens is you can gravitate too heavily toward the plays that are perceived to be the best plays, because you get in the echo chamber, you hear everybody talking about these plays that are going to be, again, they're good plays, but they're good plays in the context of this week. And in the context of the plays around them, they're only slightly better than those plays. And yet, because the week is uncomfortable, they actually end up being higher owned. I mean, it's Friday, things could change, but I was looking this morning and there was, I believe, 3 or 4 different players at like 27% or higher ownership on a week where we're kind of looking at the slate and saying, there's really nothing that stands out. You know, Cooper Kupp stands out, and he wasn't even one of those guys. Those guys were Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker, Zay Flowers, all good plays in the context of this slate, but forehead and hair above other plays around them. In some instances, maybe not even better than the plays around them. And so if you come into this week and you're like, oh man, this week's ugly, you have that tendency to lean into the plays that, well, everybody else feels comfortable with this play. I don't want to miss out on it. I don't have a sense of this slate, so I'll just jump onto this. And if you're planting that seed in your head of like, I don't know what to do with this slate, well, you won't know what to do with this slate and you'll end up on those plays. And so from a process standpoint and a processing information without judgment, a parable of the Chinese farmer standpoint, you ideally want to open each week. You have your process every week. You open your week and you just say, what is this week's puzzle? What does it look like? That's all I'm trying to do on Monday or Tuesday when I'm collecting information is, what does this week's puzzle look like? Not, is it a good high set of high total games? Is there going to be high scoring, low scoring? Is that good or bad? Instead, I'm just saying the goal is to step through my process Tuesday through Saturday night, Sunday morning, and put in the most plus EV set of rosters that I can put in for this particular week. In order to do that, I have to follow my process to solve this week's puzzle. And this week's puzzle is just whatever this week gave us. It's not good. It's not bad. It just is what it is. And so that mindset is going to help you a lot on this particular week, because sure enough, as we get to this deeper point in the week, what we're seeing is chalk very much congregating on particular plays that aren't dramatically better than other plays. You know, last week I had Raheem Mostert on 80% of my rosters, and I considered having him on 100% of my rosters. That was good chalk, right? There's nobody this week that I, outside of, again, maybe Cooper Kupp, but there's nobody this week that I'm like, oh, I want to get this guy on 50% or more of my rosters. And yet we're seeing higher ownership on this chalk than normal. So very much what this week provides for us. This week, my defense special teams pool, and this is just to illustrate what this week looks like. My defense special teams pool this week in the player grid originally had 13 defenses on it, and there's only 20 teams on the slate. So, and there was also some defenses that I left off that could have gone on there. So that tells you that it's a good week for defenses, right? That means it's a less good week for scoring, but also kind of gives you a sense of how this slate sets up as a whole, in that there's clumps of good plays and then nothing really separates this one from this one, from this one, from this one. Similarly, I mean, to a lesser extent, but similarly, my running back pool, my quarterback pool, my wide receiver pool, my quarterback pool and running back pool are actually pretty tight, but nothing really separates the plays in that pool from one another. So it's like, oh, this group is better than everything outside of this group, but within this group, what's better? I don't know. So this becomes a really good week to be different. And I look at it, I made this note, I look at it like this is the type of week where everyone is standing on level ground and hoping that lightning hits the spot that they're standing in. So if we're all on level ground, right? This isn't last week where Raheem Mostert's on a hill and everybody else is below the hill. And so you're like, well, yeah, there's a chance that the lightning strikes way over there, away from the hill. And, being on the hill didn't matter. But the likeliest place for the lightning to hit is up on that hill. If you're down on the ground, on level ground, and everybody's on level ground, but then there's these few spots that tons of people are standing in these spots, but the percentage chances of the lightning striking in those spots aren't any higher than these spots over here where there are far fewer people standing. Don't you want to be in the spots where fewer people are standing? So I talked about this on my show with Pete. I'll hit on it real quickly. I don't generally, you guys know me, I don't look at ownership projections as a heavy part of my decision-making or roster building process. So what ends up happening for me is I put my percentage allocations based on how comfortable I feel on various plays and what percentage I feel like they should be for my pool. So what happens is on a week where, let's just take, and this isn't to isolate and talk down these plays, because again, Josh Jacobs, Kenneth Walker are good plays. There's a reason why they're chalk. They're maybe slightly better than the other plays. But if I had not looked at ownership projections at all, I would be looking at this slate and saying, okay, I probably want about 12%. This is just a guess, but throwing numbers out there. My running back pool is small, so these numbers might be higher than I even want them to be. But in this example, we'll just say 12% Aaron Jones, 12% Josh Jacobs, 12% Kenneth Walker. Because to me, they all deserve relatively equal shares of ownership in my pool. Well, then we open up the slate on Sunday and Kenneth Walker is 30+% owned. Josh Jacobs is 30+% owned. Aaron Jones is 2% owned. So I'm very naturally putting myself in a plus EV position without going out of my way to say, okay, this guy is, the ownership is here, so I'm going to do this, and this guy's ownership is here, so I'm going to do this. Everybody has a different process, right? There are some people who ownership is a heavy part of their process, but this is just to tell you that you can have success without taking that approach. There are other ways to do this if you are able to block out the noise and just say, what do I like on this slate? And so this is the sort of week like that where I'm going to have all of the high-owned guys. I'm almost certainly going to be underweight the field on all those high-owned guys. But then I'm also going to be well overweight the field on some other guys who might be hair and forehead below these high-owned guys. And yet, like, that's like a little tiny rise in the land where you're like, is the lightning really that much more likely to strike this part because it's 5 inches higher than this part that's, 50 yards away? Probably not. You still have an equal shot at catching the lightning over here with far fewer people on it. So on this particular week, it's a very good week to be willing to be doing things different from the field because there are going to be some 30-point scores. And given how much ownership is likely to congregate on these, quote, ugly weeks, that the chances of the field missing out on a number of these 30-pointers are relatively high. And so you don't want to be the person who's just standing in the same spot as everybody else, fighting an uphill battle against these lower owned pieces that hit. You want to be the person who got the lower owned piece that hit and everybody else is fighting an uphill battle to beat you. So make sure you're giving yourself opportunity this week to be on those types of plays. And we're going to see people posting their wins in the Bink channel on Sunday night that got there because they were on the right plays that people weren't on that ended up hitting. So that's kind of like again, we always use the Angles email to get like a big picture macro view of the slate. And then we use the Angles podcast to kind of go to the next layer down in the funnel where we're still talking macro of the slate, but getting a little bit more into the weeds on what that means for individual players, roster construction, all of that. So with that, we have a couple things left to get to in today's show. First thing is I wanted to mention Props Insider again. So 171 spots remaining. If you have not paid attention to Props Insider, if you don't know what Props Insider is, basically Props Insider, our team does the research, our team gives you the picks, and all you have to do is have your alerts on and go put the bets in. So if you had followed every bet since March, this would be your profit, $9,458. Last year, we made over $9,000 in NBA alone. We have 171 spots remaining. Again, we do limited spots to prevent you guys from getting your bets flagged. If we have too many users kind of all taking advantage of sportsbooks with the same bets, then that increases the chances of them paying attention to the bets first and moving the lines after we post them. Other services have had that problem, and we don't want to have that problem for you guys. So 171 spots remaining. What's cool is we've got this, it's $9.99 for the whole package, takes you through the end of NBA season. We also have this basically monthly package. The way that it works is you will pay $150 a month for 7 months, which, pays for this full package, but you can also cancel at any time you want to. Some of you got in before, you're paying $170 a month. That goes for 6 months. So it works out the same way. Most of you, your payments will end in like February or March. You'll still have access all the way through the end of NBA finals in mid-June. So if you pay $150 a month right now, you're paying them every month, but your last payment would be in April, and then you would still have access through the end of May, through the end of June, because you would have paid for the whole package by that point. So because there's 8 months left and you pay for your monthly stuff for 7 months, we're just kind of labeling it as a monthly package now. And again, you can cancel it at any point. So you pay your $150 for a couple months, you decide I'm done making money off of props, and you can leave that. But what we'll do is once you grab that spot, once you grab the monthly package, you reserve a spot for yourself. You grab a spot for yourself, and we won't give that up to anybody else until you cancel your monthly payment. So as we get into what I would imagine is, again, 171 of these. There was 187 when the Angles email went out on Thursday morning. It might be down even more than 171 right now because I haven't checked in a couple hours. So there might have been a couple more sold, and this needs to be updated. But again, these spots will kind of start going, and NBA tips off on Tuesday. So that opportunity is worth hopping on if you're in a state with legal sports betting, because even if you're betting $20 a unit, $25 a unit. If you were, we recommend 100 per unit, right? But if you were betting $20 a unit, this would still be $2,000 in profit. And then again, we made what would have been another $2,000 for you in NBA last season. So very much worth grabbing one of these, seeing if this makes sense for you. You can cancel your monthly at any time. And again, these last 171 spots will be gone. But then if anybody cancels, we'll kind of let the community know, hey, there's 2 spots open right now on the monthly, and new people can hop in and grab that. So yeah, wanted to shout out all the awesome work that Xanamir and the team are doing in Props Insider. You don't have to know the sport. All you have to do is follow the bets, pop the bets in. You're going to make money over time. Other thing I wanted to talk about. So I mentioned earlier in the week that I was going to talk this week about why scoring is down, or one of the reasons why scoring is down. It didn't actually end up fitting into the structure of how I put together today's Angles podcast. So I just wanted to touch on something real quickly. There's a number of factors on why scoring is down, and we'll get to more of them throughout the season. But one of the biggest factors, as we've talked about, is the cover 2 shell that a lot of defenses are using. So cover 2 shell, you put 2 safeties deep, you force the opponent to work underneath, force them to march the field. Why? So again, cover 2 is not new. I've told the story before, but cover 2 really came to prominence in the might have even been the late 70s, but I think it was like the mid 80s, something like that. There was a story of Bill Belichick, and so I guess it was the 70s. I think it was before Belichick was with the Giants, and Nick Saban was with a different NFL team. They had become friends, had never worked together at that point, but both of their head coaches. I think that Nick Saban was in Houston with the Oilers, but I could be wrong on that. But both their head coaches really did not want their coaches talking with coaches from other teams. So the story was that Belichick and Saban went to a cabin in upstate New York and spent the upstate New York where nobody would recognize them, nobody would see them together, stayed in a cabin together for 3 nights to work through the ins and outs of the cover 2 defense and how they can maximize it as defensive play callers, but then also, guys on the defense side of the ball, but also how offenses could exploit the cover 2 defense, which helped them to better understand how to attack it from an offensive standpoint, but also how to prevent other teams from attacking them. So cover 2 has been around since way back then, right? It has just come back around over the last few years because you had Kansas City, you had Buffalo, you had these teams relentlessly attacking downfield, and defenses just weren't able to stop them. What's even bigger in that people talk about less, and why this conversation is valuable to us beyond just understanding the NFL, is we've also had a league that has moved away from an emphasis on running the ball to an emphasis on passing. And these teams, Buffalo had no run game. Kansas City had no run game. And the main way that you beat cover two is you run the defense out of cover two. You tell them, look, if you don't have that extra safety in the box, we are just going to pick up 6 yards on the ground, play after play after play. And there's no way you can stop us. We're too good at running the ball. We're going to continue picking up first downs. We'll take some underneath throws and then run the ball. And the coach say it all the time, you got to run the defense out of cover two. And so if you're able to run the ball consistently and successfully, then eventually that defense says, man, we got to drop this extra safety down in the box, stop the run. And that opens up the deep passing. So I bring that up here because, and kind of thought it would fit more in what I plan to talk about, or what I expect to talk about in the Angles podcast. But I bring it up here, A, because I said earlier in the week that I would, but B, because it is interesting with Kansas City. Patrick Mahomes said this last week that Kansas City is facing more and deeper two safety looks than they've ever faced before. He said even including 2 years ago when teams first really started throwing this at them with Tyreek Hill there. So with that, what we've seen is Kansas City develop their rushing attack, lean more on Isaiah Pacheco. And so I say that to say, Isaiah Pacheco, he's going to be over-owned this week relative to his expectations, but he is still a sharp play. He's another one of those guys in that 27+% ownership range, which is pretty crazy. But again, the Kansas City offense has developed to a point where a guy like Isaiah Pacheco actually makes sense and actually has a big role because defenses are playing them this way. And Kansas City realized, okay, one of our ways that we can continue to thrive on offense is to develop a stronger running game. And Isaiah Pacheco is our best guy for doing that. And because he's on the field more and more involved centrally to the offense, then he ends up seeing more pass game involvement as well. He doesn't get a ton of schemed pass game work, but he has a higher pass roll floor than he used to have because he's so central to the offense at this point. So just an interesting NFL discussion to touch on there and can kind of help you a little bit this week. Okay. Last portion of this show, bottom-up build. If you're new here, we typically explain several segments of this podcast, but you've followed along and you've seen what we do here. But if you're new here, bottom-up build, it started several years ago with the concept that one of the mistakes a lot of DFS players make is they start their roster building from the top down. They find the expensive pieces they want to fit, and we've all done this. And you see, I've got 3,600 in salary left. And you look through the 3,600 wide receivers and you come up with reasons why this guy could have a big game. Oh yeah, this guy could have a big game. Instead of starting from the bottom down where you get a sense of who the value is that you really like and then move up from there. So bottom up build started as a way to just take a look at the value on the slate and build a roster and see how much salary we had left over. It then developed into, let's give it a 44K salary cap, which would allow us to talk a little bit more about strategy elements. This part has been de-emphasized since we launched Inner Circle, where every week, week in and week out, we're talking and training strategy stuff. But this used to be kind of one of our main places that we could really talk through what we want to be thinking about when we build a roster. If you're not an Inner Circle member and you don't want to become an Inner Circle member, which, by the way, what is Inner Circle? We have a Wednesday training podcast with me, where I talk macro DFS strategy theory through the lens of the week behind or the week ahead. We have the Slate Saturday podcast with Xanamir and Hilo, where they go game by game and position by position, but break down the strategy on the slate, not just who the sharp plays are on the slate. So those two are those two pieces are so extremely valuable. But the other pieces are the Oracle, where we have break down 5 of the key strategy questions on the slate. Mike, Hilo, Xanamir, and I all answer those. We have afternoon only content. We have late swap content. We have some other really cool things for Inner Circle members. You get discounts on all your DFS courses. You get some free courses. So if you're a subscriber, the Inner Circle membership is hardly any more than the OWS DFS membership. So worth getting an Inner Circle. If you're not a subscriber at all and you're like, well, I don't want to pay for anything. Other places where you can find me talking about roster construction, strategy, theory, the DFS Lab Show on the OWS podcast feed and YouTube channel, my show with Pete Overzet on Fridays on his channel, my solo ship show with Squirrel Patrol on Roto Grinders. All of those places we're going to be touching on some components here. Final piece of the bottom-up build is, again, we started doing a 44K salary cap so that we could talk through strategy, and then we launched a contest with a 44K salary cap. You can find it linked on Discord in the bottom up build channel, or you can find it in my player grid when that's live in the scroll. 200 entries, cool prizes, free courses, all that to top finishers. And again, build with a 44K salary cap. Really cool contest, kind of gets your brain working in new ways and seeing the slate. And we've had, a couple weeks ago, we had somebody post 190 points spending 44K in salary. So love seeing that because it kind of helps us get a sense of, hey, where is the upside on the slate? We can really hunt for that. This week's bottom-up build, it's a unique one. I'll go through it again. We don't spend as much time on this as we used to, but some really cool stuff in this week's bottom-up build. One player who I'm going to go ahead and not mention him in the player grid in any individual sections, and yet he could be on, and I say that because he's not currently listed, and news of him probably starting came out since then, and that is Deshaun Watson. But I want to talk about him real quickly. So Deshaun Watson, well, from a standpoint of, easiest way to say it, if everybody's standing on level field hoping lightning strikes in the spot they're standing in, Deshaun Watson's spot is as likely to catch the lightning bolt as Geno Smith's spot or Matthew Stafford's spot or Sam Howell's spot or whoever else is kind of in this mid 5K to mid 6K pricing range at quarterback. So if he's as likely as these other guys and people just aren't standing in that spot, that's a spot we want to consider standing in. So he's not a better play than Geno. He's not a better play than Sam Howell. Even he's not a better play than these other guys. But what he is as good of a play as these other guys. And people just won't be on him. There's the stuff with the shoulder. There's the negativity surrounding him. There's the fact that he looked bad those first couple starts this year against, the bad weather and a good defense in Cincinnati. And then what was his second start against Baltimore? I think it might have been. Either way, he looked good against, I believe it was Tennessee that he looked good against. And was it Dorian Thompson-Robinson played against Baltimore? So whoever the other bad game was, Pittsburgh was the other bad game for Deshaun Watson. Great pass rush in Pittsburgh. So he gets a really soft matchup against Indianapolis. People won't be on him. Report this morning was that he took every first team rep and that there was good zip on his passes. So Deshaun Watson, very interesting in this bottom-up build. Another piece, I'll touch on this in the player grid, but Jerome Ford and Amari Cooper throw out the first game of the season when Nick Chubb was playing. Okay, so in 2 of the other 4 games, which only 2 of them had Deshaun Watson. So in fact, it might have been both of the games with Deshaun Watson. But in any case, 2 of the other 4 games, and I believe it was both games with Deshaun Watson, Amari Cooper and Jerome Ford combined would have kept you on a 200-point pace. One game they scored about 43 points combined. One game they scored about 46 points combined. They're 11.2K in salary, so 44.8 is exactly a 200-point pace. But really like the idea of playing them together. Again, I'll touch on that in the player grid. But then also Deshaun Watson plus Jerome Ford plus Amari Cooper, just a really sharp way to attack this slate. And I will be dramatically overweight the field on all 3 players, not necessarily because maybe not dramatically overweight the field in Jerome Ford. He is, is showing plus 10% ownership or 10% plus ownership. So I might be a little bit overweight, not dramatically. I'll be dramatically overweight the field of Amari Cooper and Deshaun Watson, not because they're head and shoulders above other plays, but because they're as good as, or in Amari's case, better than some other plays priced around them. And so my ownership in my pool will be dictated by that. And so I might be like, hey, I'm going to have 26% Amari Cooper. And then you flip open the slate on Sunday and you're like, what? He's 4% owned. Nobody wanted to play Amari Cooper. So not necessarily that I'm going out of my way to try to be overweight from a strategy perspective. It's just that he's a really sharp play. Deshaun Watson, type of guy who might be on 8 to 10 to 12% of my builds and might be only 2% owned. So just by a function of that, I'll be overweight the field on him. So bottom up build starts with Deshaun Watson, Jerome Ford, and Amari Cooper. No clear way to get Cooper Kupp without being a little bit suboptimal. I know some of you are going to prove me wrong with your builds for the bottom up build contest. We will definitely see some Cooper Kupp where you guys figure out a way to maximize the ceiling around him. But I decided to go ahead and throw Aaron Jones on here. Aaron Jones, who, as we already mentioned, basically the same well, actually a higher ceiling than Josh Jacobs, higher ceiling than Kenneth Walker. probably a higher ceiling than Josh Jacobs with this bad offensive, this underperforming offensive line of the Raiders right now, and a lower floor than both of those guys. But when we're talking about winning a tournament, what we care about is the ceiling. So broader range of outcomes, which means people don't want to play him, but the high end is higher than what people are going to get from these guys. So Josh Jacobs, can he score 25 to 30? He can. Can Kenneth Walker? He has less of a chance than Josh Jacobs, but he can. But what if both of them score those 16, 17-point scores and they've been scoring, right? And then Aaron Jones ends up going for one of his 35-pointers against Denver in his first game back from his hamstring injury. So Aaron Jones, really interesting piece, and gives us a fun starting point for this roster where we have a ton of ceiling with Deshaun Watson, Amari Cooper, Jerome Ford, and Aaron Jones. Zay Flowers, Terry McLaurin, two of my favorite sort of mid-tier wide receivers. Not a ton that we need to dig into here. Both guys will be popular. Both guys are somewhat sharp chalk. Zay Flowers is over-owned relative to his actual expectations, but it's a type of situation where he's still one of the better wide receiver plays on this slate. So, if he ends up 25% owned, I'll probably end up underweight him, but not dramatically underweight him. And not because I'm trying to be underweight him, but just because he's not that good of a play. He's just a sharp play this week. Zay Flowers, maybe on, say, 18% of my rosters. These are all guesses, right? It's Friday afternoon, and I won't know any of this until like maybe 3 a.m. on Sunday morning when I'm finishing up that part of my process. But just kind of guessing, that's where I would think that he would be. Terry McLaurin, I've played around with like 40% Terry McLaurin, but not because he's that high confidence, just because it's like, well, who's going to hit for 30 points on this slate, right? And if McLaurin misses, he still is probably getting you 10, 12, 14, which at his price tag, it's really not going to hurt you that much, especially on this slate. But where can we get the 30-pointers? He's one of the guys who has a clear shot at it. So Terry McLaurin could be anywhere from like 18% to 40+% of my rosters. But Terry McLaurin, Zay Flowers fill out those mid-range wide receivers. Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith, I mean, nobody wants to play him. Pre-touchdown PPR points per game. So week one, Jonnu Smith's stat line was 0 catches for 0 yards and 0 DraftKings points, right? Week one with this Atlanta team, throw that out. Weeks 2 through 6, like Drake London had 0 points week one as well. Weeks 2 through 6, this offense is really playing, it's hitting its stride in terms of how they want to play things. Last week, if I remember correctly, it was Kyle Pitts had 45 snaps. Jonnu Smith had 44. This has been week in and week out. Jonnu Smith is playing as many snaps as Kyle Pitts, running as many routes. I think it was 35 routes for Pitts last week, 34 for Jonnu Smith. Last week, I talked up the Desmond Ridder, Drake London, and Jonnu Smith stack. And I noticed that almost everyone who played that stack in tournaments swapped out Jonnu Smith for Kyle Pitts. Like, people just don't want to play Jonnu Smith. On my DFS Lab show with Keegan on Thursday, I recommended Jonnu Smith in the tight end spot. And then he was like, oh yeah. And I told him, like, broke down some of the numbers, and he was like, oh yeah. Well, what about Luke Musgrave? It's like, nobody wants to play Jonnu Smith, right? So I like spots like that where Jonnu Smith pre-touchdown PPR points per game throughout the first game. So these other 5 games, 10.6 pre-touchdown PPR points per game. Mark Andrews has 10.7. Mark Andrews and Jonnu Smith have the same pre-touchdown PPR points per game. Everyone else priced around Jonnu Smith is like around 7.5 or lower. Pre-touchdown PPR points per game. Only Travis Kelce, and I think even Sam Laporta is below. I think Sam Laporta is like 10.3. So only Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews, but Mark Andrews basically the exact same as Jonnu Smith. So only Travis Kelce on this slate has higher pre-touchdown production per game than Jonnu Smith. 5 to 8 targets in every game this year since week one. Very much a schemed part of this offense. So not that I'm going out of my way to play him on like 80% of builds, but just to say he's a very sharp play. Like, what is he going to be on for me? I don't know. 16%, 18%, 22% of my rosters, but way overweight the field because people just don't want to play this guy. Last 2 spots. Rondell Moore. Don't love it. I don't love it, but I didn't love Tyler Boyd last week and pulled the trigger on it way less than I should have. Seattle, we look at it and it's like, oh, number 32 against wide receivers. You see that on the DraftKings app, but it's not just wide receivers. It's wide receivers over the middle of the field. It was Amon-Ra St. Brown had a big game against them. Adam Thielen had a big game against them. I forget who else has had nice production against them. But you look at the routes that were run in those games, and it was all up. It was largely out of the slot, and it was all over the middle of the field. So Hollywood Brown does run some over the middle of the field routes. I really should have been underweight Jamar Chase last week. I ended up really prioritizing Chase, even though almost all of his routes are outside the numbers. And I even said last week that Chase doesn't run the routes that are best against Seattle, but he can be used in that way. Well, that was justifying things, right? He wasn't used in that way. And not to say that he couldn't have hit, not to say that he was a bad play, but he wasn't as good as my ownership on him said he was. And I knew that heading into the weekend. Probably had him, I think I had him on 34% of rosters and should have had him on like 18% of rosters. Probably had Tyler Boyd on like 6% of rosters and probably should have had him on like 14%. So Boyd had only 37 yards, I believe it was, but 7 catches, 37 yards, a touchdown. Ends up being a really nice DraftKings score at his price. And similar for Rondale Moore. Like, do I want to play Hollywood Brown over Rondale Moore? Yes. Will I have Hollywood Brown this week? Yes. But I'll also have some Rondale Moore because where you hit Seattle is where Rondale Moore runs his routes. So Rondale Moore, 3,500. And then my wife has told me that she is going to check on Sunday to see whether or not I played the Patriots defense. Because if I had just believed that the Patriots defense is no longer the Patriots defense, if I had just not played them the last 3 weeks, I would have had $40,000 more in my DraftKings account than I have. Would have finished in first in the slant last week instead of third if I had gone with the Lions defense instead of the Patriots on that roster. Funny thing was, when I put in the Patriots defense, Lions, it was Lions for me earlier in the week. Saturday night, it was like, oh yeah, but nobody's on the Patriots. Let me get a little bit more of them. And then I thought, you know what though? I don't have to make this decision right now. Like any of the rosters, the Patriots were 2,600, Lions were 27. And I was like, any of the rosters where the Patriots heading into the late games, they're both playing in the late games. It was like, I can go through in any of the rosters where I have the extra $100. I can swap up to the Lions if I want to. Totally forgot about that by Sunday afternoon. These rosters that I was watching at the tops of tournaments had the Patriots defense, kept the Patriots defense, had the salary to go up to the Lions, and then had that. So that would have been first in the slant for an extra 10K. And then I think it was 3 weeks ago, they finished second in the double spy with the Patriots defense getting 3 points and dropping me out of first place the last point that they lost. So that would have been an extra 30K if I just had basically any other defense there. So I don't know if I can play the Patriots defense this week in real life because I would be accountable to my wife for that if we missed out on some money again. So Patriots are going in the bottom up build, mostly because they let everything else fill and because it's kind of fun to throw the Patriots in here and get a chance to eat my mistakes with the Patriots from the last few weeks where we've had quite a bit more money with the Patriots not on my roster. So now Patriots are relegated to the bottom up build. This gives us a roster of Deshaun Watson, Jerome Ford, Aaron Jones, Amari Cooper, Zay Flowers, Terry McLaurin, Jonnu Smith, Rondale Moore, and the Patriots defense gives us exactly $6K in salary left over. With that, we went a little bit longer than normal, but wanted to get through that discussion of my process, and hopefully that was helpful to some of you. So with that, I am going to get out of here. As always, I appreciate you spending this time with me. I will see you on 1 week season throughout the weekend, and I will see you once again at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.